Take it away. Steve. Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all and to be sharing with you some of my research as well as the practical implications of that research, addressing issues of inclusion and collaboration and agility in the global virtual workplace.
Okay, so let's jump to some slides.
Great, thanks. I thought I would start by telling you just a little bit about some of the motivations for the research that I've done throughout my career, why it is that I've examined some of the things that I've examined. And see if I can get my slides working here. There we go. The research is driven by a number of observations that I've made over the years that also lend themselves to questions. Questions such as, why do different people value such distinct things at work? Do some people actually enjoy working in teams? Why do workplaces feel so unusual in other countries outside of the US or Australia? How can technology be used to fit the needs of workers? And would this process look different in other countries? Now, these observations and questions that have lent themselves to my research, I've examined in a whole variety of different organizations. Steve mentioned a few of those, and here are a few others. As you can see, large organizations, small organizations, and really spread out all across the globe. I've been fortunate enough to enter into these organizations and try to find some answers to these observations and questions. So the first question that I asked you pertained to, why can't we all just get along? The myth is that resolving conflict is most of the battle, and if everyone can simply be respectful using technology, we can be effective as a team. It's in fact a myth. And the reality is that even with very respectful interaction, conflict is going to be rife in technology-supported geographically versed teams, virtual teams. But that said, constructive debate, which is sort of the functional side of conflict, can in fact be very healthy and critical even for innovation. So this research investigated how that's true, how and why that's true. It consisted of 2 studies. We were looking at very complex innovation projects, and all of these projects bridged across different international partners located in different parts of the world. So 5 different industries, 16 different organizations, a total of 32 different cities in 4 different countries. And the industries were defense, aerospace, and telecommunications. The content of the work that these teams were conducting was they were engineering project teams. And many of them never came together face-to-face, or only very, very rarely came together face-to-face. So I'm sure all of you can relate to this. This is the kind of work that we've been doing definitely over the past year, and some of us even longer than that, pre-pandemic, communicating, interacting primarily, if not entirely, virtually. Now, a number of these teams were working specifically on a state-of-the-art military aircraft called the Joint Strike Fighter. Any of you that are in the military, I've heard of the JSF program, I'm sure. At the time, it was just launching. The program to design the Joint Strike Fighter was just launching, and it was worth $200 billion. The contract was worth $200 billion. So this was a big, expensive, complex virtual team, series of virtual teams working on this project. So in this research, we did surveys of the members of these teams over time, 3 different points in time. And we included not just the members of the teams themselves that were working on the project, but also those who would be receiving the engineering plans, the designs that the engineering teams had created. So they were internal customers, but they were downstream in the process. We were also able to record the teleconference meetings to examine the different patterns of communication that had occurred. So this is pre-Zoom, before Zoom had made its way into our common working vernacular. And these teams were participating via teleconference, but it's the same principle. We record many of our Zoom meetings now. We were recording teleconferences amongst these team members previous to Zoom. So what did we find? Well, I think some pretty interesting findings here with this project. We found that intimacy increased at a faster rate when using technology than face-to-face. Okay, so any of you who are in the online dating game, maybe you've experienced this as well, I don't know. But certainly in these teams, the members became closer and got to know each other much better at a faster rate than the teams that were only using face-to-face communication. The distributed collaborators actually participated more often in the conference calls than those that were co-located. So when we compared those teams where members were meeting face-to-face with those teams that were not, we found that the participation was actually more equal in the virtual technology-enabled meetings. So there was something about the technology that was enabling people who maybe otherwise wouldn't participate to actually participate. So that was a good thing. And that the extent to which people felt close and experienced a sense of closeness with their team members was actually more important than the physical distance, the miles that separated people on these teams. So what that says is that the members could in fact feel close, develop close relationships on the team, tight working relationships, even when they were physically very far apart, if they psychologically felt close to the other members of the team. We also found that the certain teams were able to develop what we came to refer to as a psychologically safe communication climate. So this is an atmosphere within a team that's characterized by very open and supportive communication, but also a willingness to speak up and share your thoughts and opinions, even when they might be different from the rest of the team. And when we compared those teams that had the supportive communication climate, even when they were geographically dispersed, they were more innovative than those teams that did not have the supportive communication climate. So it mattered less how geographically dispersed or technology dependent the members were. What really mattered is the psychologically safe communication climate. And the communication climate could overcome a lot of the problems associated with being geographically dispersed or with having to rely on technology. This is just a summary of what I just said. With the communication climate, the psychologically safe communication climate, being virtual was no longer a liability, but without it, the team struggled. So let's just examine a little bit what happens to create the psychologically safe communication climate and compare it or contrast it to a communication climate that is not psychologically safe. So I like to say it all starts with you and me, and that initial idea that somebody expresses, the initial disclosure or the initial risk that somebody in the team takes, maybe with kind of an off-the-wall idea that they're not sure others are going to support. So first team member voices that idea, shares that idea with others. If the other people in the team respond in a very defensive manner, sort of demonstrating closed-mindedness, superiority, certainty, a sense of evaluativeness or control, then we get this downward spiral, loss of trust, a feeling that people need to protect themselves, increasing divisions possibly within the team, subgroups within the team, and a defensive climate. Not a good thing. On the other hand, and it feeds back, right? So as soon as that defensive climate has been created, and that's kind of everyone's expectation, feeds back to create even more defensive responses. We can contrast that though with this supportive, psychologically safe communication climate. Someone shares an initial idea and we respond to it in a candid way with a problem orientation, spontaneously asking for provisions. Well, when might that work? Or how could that actually help? These sorts of responses then create a sense of empathy, and trust among others, a willingness to continue to disclose and share risky ideas, and essentially that psychologically safe communication climate. And again, once the climate's created, once we have this sort of expectation, this shared sense of supportiveness, then that is a feedback loop that continues to create supportive responses and encourage those supportive responses. So it really starts with that very initial response to the ideas that are shared within the team. So I invite you to think just for a moment about a team that you're either on right now, maybe in this class or in other classes or at work, and think about some of the conversations that you might have had on that team recently. Maybe someone shared an idea with the rest of the team members. How did the rest of the team respond? Did you respond in a way that was closed-minded, that shut them down, that made them kind of feel backed into a corner? Or did the team respond in a way that was problem-oriented, like, let's consider this. What might be some ways this could work? What might be the boundaries under or conditions under which we could consider this idea? You don't necessarily have to agree with the initial idea, right? You don't have to go that far, but you're responding in a way that's supportive and encouraging all the same, right? So maybe you were that person that had that initial risky idea. How did your team members respond to you? Did you feel defensive as a result? Did you feel supported? Okay, let's move on. Second question on the quiz was about selecting the right people and giving them the right task, with the idea being that if we do that, all will be well, right? When we collaborate across cultures. Well, that is also a myth, my research suggests. The reality is that relationship development and intercultural competencies are equally as critical as selecting the right people and the right tasks. And in fact, when you have deep relationships that have been formed and people have intercultural competencies on the team, that can mitigate a lot of the personnel problems or a lot of the task constraints. Okay, so really, really critical to develop those relationships and those competencies. And I'm writing about this right now in a paper that is being revised and resubmitted for one of our top empirical journals in our field. So scientific study of this bears out a lot of what I'm going to share with you. So this particular project it's a massive project. It's a collaboration among academic scientists, companies, and nonprofit organization and at-risk communities. And these at-risk communities happen to be in Australia, rural Australia, where Steve and I were most recently residing before moving and joining Pepperdine. The objectives of the project were to progress leaders in the companies beyond just an awareness of the cultural differences that characterize the various places of business that they operate, and to instead help them to take that awareness and incorporate it into the way in which they interact with others and the way they make decisions. So it's not just acknowledging that differences occur, but being able to act and make decisions based upon that acknowledgement. We also had hoped to document the individual competencies and organizational capacities that were built through this program, right? We wanted to provide evidence that developing relationships, corporate and community member relationships, would in fact create some change in the individuals, but also in the organizations. And then finally, and most importantly, this was an act of corporate social responsibility. It was a CSR program that was designed to actually create change in the communities, to provide uplift in these at-risk communities where people were having health problems, substance abuse problems, children having difficulty staying in schools, high crime rates, right? These were not very nice places to live, and yet companies had the opportunity to partner with the communities and to build projects that the community members decided were important to them and uplift the communities as a result. This is a sample report for one of the corporate volunteers that participated. And what you see here is the orange bar is the score for that individual on a particular dimension of cultural competency prior to having gone into the volunteer position, the 6-week secondment. The blue bar shows their score after they had finished the corporate secondment. Okay, and so you see all this wonderful positive change occurring across all these different aspects of interacting with people from other cultures. And what's really interesting here, you might recognize some of the names of these terms as personality characteristics, essentially, right? Non-judgmentalness, inquisitiveness, tolerance for ambiguity, optimism, right? These are things that personality scholars have said don't change in your lifetime. They remain stable. They form from birth or from very early on in your life as a result of your early childhood experiences, and they remain stable throughout your lifetime. What we found is that by going into these extreme situations, the corporate volunteers spending 6 weeks in a pretty foreign environment, although many of the corporate volunteers were Australian, they'd not spent time in remote Australian communities, and they'd not spent time interacting with Indigenous partners. So this was a growth experience for them. It was transformational. And we saw growth and change even in these characteristics or competencies that psychologists in the past have said are not going to change over the course of their life. So it just shows you how incredibly powerful the experience was. We asked the volunteers to target one of these domains before they went into the secondment. We wanted them to have a particular goal that they could work on. And this sample person, person X, had chosen to work on interpersonal engagement. And what we mean by that is their ability to interact with others and engage with others at a deeper level, right? Not just superficial cocktail conversation, right? But actually getting to know someone and understand how they view the world and what their perspective is and what's important to them. And for this particular secondee, we saw phenomenal growth on this particular characteristic. They catapulted from what was really essentially a very low to moderate level of interpersonal engagement to a very high level of interpersonal engagement. So participants said, that this was a this is it moment, that they experienced powerful personal development. One secondee said it was the most powerful developmental experience she'd ever had in her life. Others said, it's vital to do this to avoid wasting time, but also to avoid causing conflict through misunderstandings. Another person said, I'll now be a little more confident in interacting with local communities. Before I was just an observer, but now I'm more prepared to go in and start up conversation, and I want to have even a better understanding. Okay, so it was through this corporate community collaboration that we saw this kind of growth in individuals. And I want to just before I move on to the third myth, I just want to emphasize that this kind of corporate social responsibility is not common, right? I mean, CSR, corporate social responsibility, receives a lot of lip service. A lot of companies throw money at problems, but are not as deeply engaged or willing to actually go out and help communities or help various segments of the population that need that help. So, it shows you the power of doing that beyond just a company just channeling money to a particular cause, right? All right. Third and final quiz question was about the kinds of technology we use to meet, right? And the myth was members of teams need face-to-face time. Whenever possible, bring people together in the same room for bonding. That was the myth. The reality is that many organizations don't have a choice of virtual or not. We certainly didn't during the pandemic, right? It's the strategic use of multiple means of communicating with technology over time that results in effective teams. And that's actually really good news, right? So we may not have a choice of being able to meet face-to-face, but what we quite likely do have a choice of is which technologies are we going to use and when in order to connect with other members of a virtual team, right? Or a virtual project. So this, again, is a very recent kind of hot off the press set of findings, looking at navigating your learning processes in your teams through your technology use. And it's in press right now at a journal called Organization Science. Okay, so let's back up a little bit and say, well, why were we motivated to even do this research in the first place? Turns out that the most common practice in a lot of organizations is just relying on a single technology, right? Out of habit. Maybe you're guilty of this, right? Maybe email for everything or texting. No matter what, you just default to your texting, and that's the way in which you stay in touch and share information, right? In my era, it was email. That was how we defaulted, right? We defaulted to using email, even if that was or is not necessarily the best technology for a particular task. That's what we tended to use because that's what we perhaps were first trained with, or it was the most comfortable based upon our history with that particular technology. But what we know is that as teams continue to work together, and if they want to learn and innovate, create, they have to cycle through a series of different tasks, right? Over time, the project doesn't stay the same. There's different activities involved at each phase of the project. So you might think of it in terms of a learning cycle, if you will. The beginning, it's all about accumulating knowledge, right? Accumulating all the information that you're going to need, surfacing ideas, surfacing perspectives, acquiring that knowledge. And then as time goes on, you amass so much information, now you've got to combine it, right? You've got to figure out a way to arrive at a common understanding. So there might be some debate, right? There might be some integration that's occurring. And then finally, whatever the project might be, there's quite likely going to be an implementation phase where the knowledge is going to be implemented either into a decision or into a deliverable or into a product or into the service that you're creating, right? So as team members cycle through these learning processes, it's quite likely you're going to need to use different technologies. So we posed the question, what if teams were capable of developing a connection repertoire, a strategic connection repertoire that enabled them the agility to shift technology to fit these different learning processes? What if they did that? So for example, in the early phases, we thought, you know what, makes sense. We all got to get on the same page. So maybe at this phase, it's really important to focus people's attention with the technology. And then as time goes on and you're integrating that knowledge, then you need technologies that are going to help you iterate through different cycles of making sense, right? We call that iterative sense making. And then finally, as you go through to the implementation phase, you got to be able to codify. You got to be able to post and share information either in a repository, in a report, right? And you think about some of the project teams that you're on right now as part of your degree program at Pepperdine, right? You go through these cycles. You're collecting information and you're trying to focus people on the task at hand, right? Maybe people are going off in all directions and you need to get them all on the same page. And then there has to be at some point a process of making sense of that knowledge, trying to put that knowledge to use. And in order to do that, you have to interpret it. You have to talk about it, discuss it. And then you create the final deliverable, right? Whether that be a report. And then in your project teams that you would be working on in your organizations, it could quite likely be a product or a service. All right. So this was the idea that we started with, and we went into a particular organization. It's called Alcoa. Alcoa is a bauxite mining company. They refine the bauxite into aluminum, right? And then aluminum is used for all different kinds of products, which they ship out all over the world. They operate in 31 different countries. And I was lucky enough to have an Australian Research Council grant to fund this research. Here's a picture of the different facilities that they have. It really is a very globally dispersed organization. They span all these different countries. And this is what their teams look like. This is a picture of the teams. There was a representative at each of the refineries across the world on the team. And they represented a particular phase in the refining process. So I'll give you an example. Probably none of you are chemical engineers. If you are, you might know something about refining. I didn't know anything about it coming into this project, but I learned a lot. Everything I ever didn't want to know about refining. And one of the processes is called calcination. So it's a process of entering certain chemicals into the process and then removing certain waste after a chemical reaction has occurred, right? And so there was an expert in calcination at each one of the different refineries on the calcination team. Okay, and they were supported by a variety of tools, right? We like to think they had a whole buffet of different tools that they could utilize. They had an archival SharePoint repository that they could codify their information and knowledge within, and then they had an expert directory as well that they could use, and those supported the teams. There were 50 of these teams, and again, as I mentioned, one member from each of the different refineries. Their core objective was to share knowledge, solve problems, and develop process innovations. So Alcoa formed these teams because essentially they wanted to save some money. They wanted to create operational efficiencies across the different refineries. There were some refineries that were operating really quite well. So operationally, they were efficient, but others were not. And so they had this sense that if they could bring members of teams together all across the world and share, for example, calcination best practices and roll those out across all the refineries, that would help to establish operational efficiencies across the entire organization. So lifting up the operational efficiencies through identifying what were the very best operational practices in the company all across the different locations. So when we say operational best practice, we're literally referring to a procedure that's codified in a document that has work instructions. And, one of the examples that was shared with me is the timing of changing over a particular pump, right, in the refining process. So they would, as a team, discuss this particular operational procedure, arrive at the very best timing that fit all the various locations, codify that, and then it became best practice across the organization. So this research was also multi-phase. It occurred over a number of years, almost 10 years. We studied the introduction of the teams. We studied the process innovations, the actual codifications that they had established in their repository. We also observed the teams at face-to-face events whenever they could come together. We recorded their teleconferences again, as we did in the prior project. We did surveys. We did surveys with individuals. We did surveys with teams. We asked members outside the teams to rate the teams in terms of their effectiveness. And then we did a field experiment where we had done some measurement before a training intervention. We did some training, and then we did some measurement afterwards. Okay, so that we call that a quasi-experimental design within the organizations. I'm not going to talk about all of these phases. I just wanted to give you a sense of the rigor, the scientific rigor of the research and the longitudinal nature of the research. We were in this organization for many years and really got to know these teams and these team members and what were the things that were going to help propel them to greater effectiveness. I mentioned the interviews. Those were critical, 71 different interviews, many conference calls. I mean, one of the interesting aspects of the conference calls, I mentioned earlier about the fact that technology-enabled teams often have more equal participation around team members when they're really functioning well. And so we were really curious about the turns at talk. This is a communications concept, actually, in the communications scholarship, where we measure each time a person talks. And then we look at how many turns each member had at talking within the team. And we can then arrive at the extent to which there was equal participation across the team members, and we can compare teams on the number of turns at talk and how equal the teams are at turns at talk. So that was one of our measures. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we had these surveys of the team members as well. And I was lucky enough to go to all those places that you saw on the globe previously, and to see the facilities, tour the facilities, meet with the teams. I conducted the training on site at these different locations. So it was a wonderful opportunity to really understand their processes. So we did a whole variety of different analyses. I'm not going to go into the details here. Again, I just wanted to give you a sense of when we conduct this kind of organizational research in the field of organization science, I mean, we leave no stone unturned, right? We look at a particular team and how its processes unfold over time, right? That's what I call a within team trajectory of the development of that team. We compare between different teams, right? We run sophisticated statistical analyses looking at that survey data. And in this project, we even looked at how the teams were shifting from one learning process to another and how the technology was helping them to do that or not, right? So we were looking at what we call a transition analysis from one aspect of the learning process to another. So here's a profile of a particular team across 4 different points in time. This was a really effective team. And remember I said there were the 3 processes to learning in teams: accumulating knowledge, integrating the knowledge, and then implementing the knowledge. So what you see here are the extent to which the team is engaging in those behaviors. And then you're looking at the extent to which they are utilizing technologies that enable each of these different kinds of processes. So at time 1, this team was really highly engaged in accumulating knowledge. And in fact, they were using the technologies we thought they probably should be using, which was to focus people's attention, right? The AF, 40% of their time was spent on a technology that enabled them to focus the team's attention. As they moved on through time, they started engaging in other kinds of activities, not just accumulation. And as you got to time 3, you can see they're now primarily engaging in implementation. They're ready to implement that knowledge and that learning that they created. And as a result of moving into that learning process, they shifted technologies, right? So as of time 3, 55% of their time was on technology that enabled them to codify publicly what it is they were going to do, what the operational procedures were. And then at time 4, an even higher percentage, right? 49% of their time, relatively speaking, spent in public codification. And that fit really nicely with their focus on implementation tasks at that point, right? So these bullets here are just building for you that process that they engaged in of shifting from different tasks and different technologies. So in summary, this very effective team, as learning processes changed, they also shifted their technology use, and then they shifted it in the way that we had predicted would help them to be more effective, right? A couple other of the analyses that we used, I mentioned that we did some pretty sophisticated statistical analysis. This one is called hierarchical polynomial regression analysis. Very, very fancy term. And what it basically means is that we're looking at the extent to which performance is a function of an interaction between their learning phase and their technology. So it's another way of presenting the data that you saw earlier, right? That in fact, to stay effective, they needed to shift, and they needed to shift in a particular way, their technology use. Okay, so the summary here, again, I'm not going to go through all the statistical details, but teams were more effective when they exhibited a fit between their learning processes and their technology use. Okay, now you know in your project teams that you're shifting across those different learning activities, right? You can't stay within information accumulation and knowledge accumulation. If you do, you're never going to be able to create your final deliverable, right? So what this research is saying is the most effective teams, as they move through those learning processes, to get beyond that accumulation of knowledge, to move into a sense-making process, you're quite likely going to need to shift your technology, right? Maybe previously you were primarily relying on a email exchange, and what you're going to need to shift into is a Zoom meeting, right? In order to get to that sense-making process. It was okay to shift to communicate via email when you were accumulating knowledge, but not okay as you're moving into that sense-making phase of your learning and of the project. You need to shift over to a different technology that allows you to have that interpretive discussion and integrate the knowledge that you've collected. So this project had a lot of impact by a whole variety of different measures. I presented only one aspect of the studies that we did. We did a whole series of studies and additional analyses on very related topics within this organization. So we've done a lot of academic publishing and presentations. The organization extracted a lot of value. They were able to engage in leadership development, training programs. They feel as though self-reported that they had greater engagement among their workforce across about 20,000 employees that were involved in the research. And our key contact has estimated about $100 million per year in operational efficiencies that they've created through improving things like, for example, the use of technology across the learning phases. So here's a testimonial from the key contact at Alcoa. He's saying, our global virtual teams have developed. We realized we had large gaps in understanding how teams should operate to maximize the impact. We partnered with me, with Cristina, and her team to study our groups and to plan detailed interventions. And accessing that knowledge and that know-how has made a step change in team performance through improved internal processes, broader understanding of how to manage and benefit from the diversity in their groups. The work improved their internal knowledge, but also left systems in place that ensure the improvements are sustained. So just share that testimonial with you to ensure you that if you take the time to engage in some of these processes that I've mentioned today, right, across the 3 different myths, if you are a myth buster and you implement the reality that the research has revealed, you too in your project teams can experience these kind of benefits to your effectiveness.